We are talking Fahrenheit 451. This one is directed by Ramin Bahrani and of course is based on the classic Ray Bradbury novel. I believe this was also made in a movie in the 60s. And this one stars Michael B. Jordan as Guy Montag, who is the protagonist of the movie. You've also got Michael Shannon and Sophia Boutella. So the story is set in a future where essentially information has been stifled, all the books have been burnt, and we have essentially a paramilitary fire sort of force ultimately that act as both kind of like firemen, police and the military, and they essentially want to kind of wipe out any trace of books, of things like that, of things that kind of relate to any type of narrative which is not controlled by the sort of the government ultimately. And on the flip side we have what's known as the ills, which are the kind of I guess the revolution, the kind of the people who are trying to preserve the kind of like the history and stuff like that. And Michael B. Jordan is essentially a high-ranking kind of fireman, but he starts to question his kind of like his belief system when he kind of meets Sophie Boutella's character, and ultimately starts to think maybe, you know, it's not as idyllic as the kind of the government, so to speak, would want to have us believe. Now this is quite timely, especially I would say with the kind of the advent of the fake news phenomena, obviously in kind of recent years, and the whole idea of this kind of story is ultimately the narrative that is being fed to the people. And there's a couple of lines here about, you know, how people essentially gave up reading, and rather than reading the whole article on the news, they would just read the headline, things like that. So it is, I feel it is somewhat of a timely movie to come out, obviously in 2018, despite obviously this being, you know, somewhat of an older source material. But they do a good job. In some aspects, yes, and in some aspects, no. So the main issue to this movie is the book is actually quite nuanced, and I feel a lot of that is kind of lost within this movie, and it ultimately becomes crumbles under its own weight. There are some good stuff to be had here. I think obviously it's got a great cast. Michael B. Jordan, hot off Black Panther, obviously Michael Shannon as well, and you know, so it's got a pretty decent cast here, and the world building, I've got to say, is, you know, really nice. It's very much like a kind of a Blade Runner aesthetic, this future with this kind of constantly these messages kind of being to everyone, and kind of, you know, really controlling the kind of the way people think. And I think it's a scary time, because it's, you know, it's one possible future with social media and everyone kind of so, you know, interested in their sort of social media presence, and it's a scary thought. Maybe this is one way that the human race will go. So there's definitely some parallels to be had here with kind of like with modern life. So I thought it does a good job of maybe having some sort of visual kind of and visual references to maybe things that could happen, and a scary kind of future possibility. And I've got to say, I did enjoy both Michael B. Jordan and Michael Shannon in their roles, and they're pretty much the whole cast here do a pretty decent job. And like I said, it visually and cinematically it looks pretty good for a TV movie. This is an HBO film. But on the flip side, I've got to say, as I've mentioned, it doesn't feel quite as kind of deep. There are certain things that are changed from the novel here, and certain things that are omitted, and because of that, it feels kind of oversimplified to a sort of certain point, and you know, ultimately as well becomes a little bit dull, believe it or not. So you feel like it's treading water a lot of the time, and whilst there are some aspects of the story that are obviously that are translated to the book, it just doesn't feel as good as the sum of its parts ultimately. So although it's certainly not a bad movie, and I do feel it visually is very, very interesting, it just doesn't fit cohesively as a kind of as an interesting story when you compare it to the source material. I know it's very easy to kind of like say, you know, adaptations from books are never as good as the book, but there are examples where that does happen, or it's as good as the book. But this one, it doesn't feel like the makers of the film have quite got the book, if that makes sense. And what we've got is that it's a kind of a slightly different kind of vision, which isn't maybe as interesting, but still maybe enough to kind of keep, you know, somewhat of cerebral for sci-fi fans happy. You know, like I say, it looks very good. There just doesn't feel like there's as much substance here as it could have been. But overall, it's maybe worth a look. I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment. I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.